Torpedoes to starboard. Problem solved, sir. The ship is on fire.
Well, so apparently, I'm still alive in real life. Perhaps unfortunately. But anyways, welcome back to Worship with CS, of all things. A bit of a surprise, I guess. I figure, right now it's probably about a good time for me to finally put up this video. It's obviously been a pretty long time since I've had an upload down here, and especially for Warships content. In that regard, it's been a couple of months. Sorry about that. So this video is kind of eclectic. It features obviously relatively decent replays, interesting enough games. Obviously a 7-kill, 189k damage Bismarck game, as well as two relatively intriguing, perhaps, games with the Gneisenau Tier 7 German battleship, as well as a Kraken Unleashed game in the Tier 4 British cruiser, the Danae, which is obviously a ship that belongs to a line I tried to grind at one point, but kind of stopped the grind for perhaps obvious reasons for a lot of people. But anyways, that's that. So let's see what we have here.
Enemy force sighted on the horizon.
Essentially, this replay came from weeks ago when I first got my Bismarck, if not months ago. I believe this was not that long after I finally deleted the game, or should I say the ship, with essentially the maxed out fire control, the top hull, propulsion, and everything. So perhaps this replay will be a good place for us to figure out how the Bismarck behaves, if you are kind of on the fence about whether or not to proceed with this grind or purchase this ship, or kind of lag behind and just want to figure out what's going on without having to pay the price yourself. So here we are. So I will say that the Bismarck is a fairly decent, solid battleship at Tier 8, even though it's kind of unusual. Doesn't mean that being unusual is a bad thing. For starters, the Bismarck has essentially the most hit points of any Tier 8 battleships at almost 70k, versus around 66k for Mali and North Carolina. I believe only 60k for the upcoming KGV for the British, as well as the Alabama, which give or take,
Enemy heavily damaged.
I believe 65 or 64k. So the Bismarck has more health, and ultimately that's historically accurate, because the Bismarck, even though on paper it was essentially a treaty battleship, that's supposed to be designed to displace 35,000 tons. Obviously, the Germans, as with many other nations at the time, kind of skimp on the rules and made their ships bigger than or should I say heavier than listed on paper. So in reality, the Bismarck in the real life displays maybe a little over 50,000 tons. Obviously in wartime conditions, you can probably overload it even more with things like fuel and ammo and supplies. So that kind of translates into relatively solid survivability for the Bismarck in warships. And obviously survivability isn't a parameter that's purely based off HP. Sure, inescapably HP is going to be a big deal because flooding and fire, especially a destroyer and cruiser and aircraft carrier-rich environment, it's a very prominent mechanic. Sometimes they will make and break your game, but also in terms of the ship's resistance to armor-piercing shells and penetrations, it's also very solid. I believe the Bismarck has a 320mm thick main armor belt. Its citadel essentially sits entirely under the waterline, so that when you get hit, and if you do get hit, and if the hits have enough penetration to actually go through, most likely they will miss the citadel because the citadel sits so low, so that you kind of avoid those 10,000k, or should I say 10k damage hits. But unfortunately, the Bismarck very much follows the armor schemes of many of the World War I era dreadnoughts. Because it's not an all-or-nothing design that the Americans, the Japanese at this point in history had adopted, which in that case, their engine room, their boiler rooms, their ammo storage and stuff like that are armored as heavily as possible. Meanwhile, things that are closer to the deck, that are such as the crew bunks, the galley, the pantries, that kind of stuff, are not armored at all. In that scheme, essentially, the ships can, be armored, to the teeth when it comes to their vitals. But then, all the areas of secondary importance just simply have no armor. So, in that regard, the Bismarck essentially have moderate armor, even along the most weakly armored part of his hull, without skimming on the main armor belt and citadel. So that the good thing about that scheme is that, sometimes if a destroyer or some of the light cruisers hit you, most likely they will just simply bounce. But unfortunately, sometimes when you get hit by larger caliber weapons, which would have, in many cases, hit the armor parts of, let's say, North Carolina or Amati, and simply overpan without detonating because there's not even enough armor for the fuses to arm. In those cases, those shells would explode in the Bismarck and do normal damage pens, which is about 3K to 4K depending on the caliber of the gun. So, in other words, your citadel is safer, but more than anything, you get more normal penetrating shells, or should I say hits. Another thing about the armor scheme for the Bismarck is the fact that it has what they call a turtleback armor scheme, which means the citadel, which sits low under the waterline, also has this armor deck that kind of bends downward and outwards along the edges of the hull, at angles that's neither perpendicular nor parallel to the waterline. That kind of serve as a secondary armor layer that will stop penetrating projectiles fired by enemy ships from reaching the ship's vitals as a second line of defense. So, that once again, allows the ship to avoid citadel hits in many cases, especially when enemies only have smaller caliber weapons, or when they're close, and thus the trajectory of their guns are flat. But unfortunately, that same feature essentially renders the Bismarck, as well as any ship with that feature, more vulnerable to plunging fire, which is when enemy ships are further away, they will shoot at you, and your projectiles can have a pretty high arc, and at the end of the trajectory they'll kind of come down vertically and essentially cancel out the angling of your turtleback armor, which could have been okay if the ship had good deck armor aside from the turtleback armor, but unfortunately the German ships really do not. And that's also another design trait they carried over from World War I era ships, simply because many ships designed in World War I still had essentially taken previous battle experiences, such as the Russo-Japanese Wars or the first Sino-Japanese Wars naval fighting experience, that suggests many of the gunnery engagements on the high seas going to occur in relatively close range, 10 kilometers, 8 kilometers or less, which means plunging fire is unlikely. But we are now talking about World War II like context, and very well aimed and in some cases radar directed enemy fire from close to 20 kilometers. So suddenly your weak decks become a major liability. And of course, I heard that they might be coming out with armor-piercing bombs for dive bombers for aircraft carriers, which is also going to be a big problem for many of these World War I style battleships, especially the German battleships, even up to the World War II era designs. Just simply because they didn't design with such a possibility in mind. So that's that. So going back to the Bismarck, what else is notable about the Bismarck? I would say that in the eyes of some people, the Bismarck is undergunned, because the Bismarck only has 8 guns versus the 9 on the American battleships or the 10 on the Amagi, which is Japanese. And also the weapons are 15 inches, which is 380 millimeters, versus 16 inches, which in different cases could be 406 millimeters or 410 millimeters. So these guns, as characteristics of many German weapons in real life as well as in wargaming games, essentially fire a lighter projectile, a smaller caliber projectile at higher velocity. So that going back to the whole trajectory arc and plunging fire topic, essentially the Bismarck has relatively low trajectory, more likely than anything, and even depending on the range, most likely you're gonna, more than anything, have most of your shots hit the enemy's ships slightly up rather than downward. Another thing about the fact that these are smaller caliber guns for a tier 8 is the fact that they do less alpha damage than the 16 inches you're used to, and obviously significantly less alpha damage than the 17 inches and 18 inches you get on some of the tier 9s and tier 10s. One good thing about these weapons, and perhaps for the sake of game balance and also to extent historical accuracy, is the fact that these weapons reload more quickly than what you're used to with the 16 inches in game, which is give or take a half-minute reload on, let's say, the Amagi, perhaps the Nagato or the North Carolina, or even the Iowa. I believe they have a 26-second reload. Personally, I do not have any mod to make the reload quicker or to mess with the turret rotation speed, because speaking of turret rotation speed, this Bismarck also has very quick turret rotation for a battleship. I believe stock, the turrets are able to rotate 180 degrees in 36 seconds, and my captain does have the expert marksman skill, which shortens the rotational speed for 180 degrees down to, I believe, 31-32 seconds. which means you will be more resistant against being circumstrafed by destroyers or cruisers. And
Torpedoes, direct
you
front.
have reasonable good flexibility to micro-adjust
Torpedoes,
and to
dead ahead.
compensate should
Enemy
you have
destroyer
to essentially
blown
change
up.
target.
Hang in there. Help is on the way.
Flex between one enemy and another, or perhaps splitting your firepower against the two, depending on the position of your angle. A lot of people go as far as to say that the Bismarck has pretty good AA, but in my eye, I tend to see the AA for the Bismarck as being decent but not great. Partly because the Bismarck, as with many of the Axis battleships, such as the Veneto class of the Italians, or the Bismarcks, or much better the Yamatos, or any of the Japanese battleships, is the fact that the purpose of their secondary armament is kind of split. They have these heavy, give or take 150 or as with the Italians at 152, or the Japanese 155, as taking off the Mogamis, essentially heavy anti-surface secondary guns. The theory is that they kind of need a higher throw weight and heavier projectiles to essentially neutralize heavier enemy destroyers and light cruisers that are coming in for perhaps the torpedo runs. Meanwhile, these ships, as in my case, the Bismarck has essentially a separate set of 105mm guns that's also capable of AA. So essentially, when you are dedicating resources and spaces and precious weight on your battleship for an anti-surface only heavy or should I say secondary armament, you essentially give up a lot of potential capability in anti-air department. So obviously versus North Carolina, which has 10 double 38 caliber 5 inches, my ship only gets 8 double 105mm. So the heavy AA armament is unfortunately not as heavy as some of the competition. Meanwhile, the light AA armament of the Bismarck consists of 20mm as well as 37mm. The 20mm is almost like heavy machine guns. The Americans get those. The Japanese don't, because the Japanese essentially have the 25mm that carries the duty of both the medium weight AA weapons as well as the light AA weapons. But I guess you can look at the 20mm as weapons that only do damage when the enemies are close to dropping their ordnances or after they have already dropped. So they're really a long-term attrition weapon. Meanwhile, your medium caliber AA guns, essentially do the groundwork. And that's also the same reason why the Japanese AA is kind of bad. The Bismarck is mediocre because the 37mm have relatively limited DPM, and also there aren't that many of them versus sheer number of 40mm you get on the American battleship. But ultimately that's kind of historically accurate because it reflects different philosophies they design for battleships designed for the Pacific and for the Atlantic. Obviously in the Atlantic, the weather's worse, so aviation doesn't impact you as much. And of course, going back to the armor thing, perhaps due to poor sea state and poor weather, a lot of times Mother Nature forces the engagement range to be closer. Well, excuse the rambling, but it's just a lot of information to consider. I'm sure not everybody can follow through, and probably a lot of people just get lost. But I think a lot of people are ADHD anyways. You know how that is. So I guess to sum up, the Bismarck it's a very solid Tier A battleship. In my eyes, it might not be the best Tier A battleship, because personally I like North Carolina more, with its heavier shells and all-nothing armor and much better AA, even though it's also a slower ship than the Bismarck. Ultimately, I think the Bismarck it's a very nice ship for
Destroyed enemy battleship.
this exact environment we're dealing with in Warships, as in, very destroyer and cruiser heavy, a lot of short range skirmishes, which favors his weapons characteristics and as well as his weapon, or should I say as his armor. So that's that. And so here we are, the second replay for today's video. This replay, along with one of the other replays that's coming up in this video, actually came from a previous season of ranked battles on Warships, which, if you have not done such a game mode yourself, or you haven't tried it, is 7-on-7 essentially competitive play. The maps are essentially the same maps you see in normal random battles, but the meta is different. For that, there's usually two caps that are close by and in the middle of the map, and being 7-on-7, a lot of times, there really needs to be teamwork, and nobody can really afford mistakes. Another thing to know about ranked battles is the fact that game balance and matchmaking is really messy. Because depending on the map and depending on the performance of the players involved, things such as how many battleship matches with how many battleships, how many cruisers faces off against how many cruisers, and how many destroyers get to deal with how many destroyers, is really a big deal. So point is a very important thing in ranked battle, because a lot of times one team will achieve more success in the actual engagement by damaging and sinking enemies, but
Enemy force detected.
often they simply do not control the caps, and the enemy can still manage to cap out and win. Meanwhile, with the teams being so small and so that everybody have a smaller health pool to chip away and to work with and to preserve, both sides of the equation, concealment and vision is very important. This is when the destroyer thing comes into play. You want the destroyers to be able to spot enemies early, to help the team consider and predict where they're going and what they're doing. And sometimes through concealment and through smoke, the destroyers can also provide much needed protection against their allied units, such as battleships,
Torpedoes,
which in
direct
some
front.
situations are very vulnerable to stealth firing,
Torpedoes, dead ahead.
HE fire spam, as well as torpedoes.
Torpedoes, direct front.
So as I've realized, the destroyers often make or break the game.
We've destroyed an enemy cruiser.
As far as my ship's concerned, obviously first of all I have to apologize for the fact that I'm essentially showing contents on the Gneisenau without actually doing my proper Gneisenau video I had spoken of previously, which has been sitting on my hard drive for a very long time, but I just simply never got a chance to get to it. So the Gneisenau, it shares a lot of design characteristics and similarities with the Bismarck I previously discussed earlier in the video. It does have weak deck armor, typical of German ships of this era. It carries the same weapon as the Bismarck, which is the same 15-inch 52 caliber, 380mm guns that have relatively flat arc, decent range, high muzzle velocity, and less alpha than the 16 inches. In terms of armor, the Gneisenau is very much similar to the Bismarck. As I said before, relatively thin deck armor, a turtleback armor that complements the deck armor that, kind of work as a double-edged sword. That, in close range situations can effectively protect your citadel from, enemy penetrations. But, in long range engagement can sometimes, allow enemy plunging fire to hurt you seriously. The armor belt is very solid, in contrast to the relatively thin deck armor. And in terms of speed, the Gneisenau is actually capable of 32 knots versus 31 on the Bismarck, which is also, the fastest for each tier. Obviously, the Tier A Bismarck faces off against Amagi, which does 30.1, and the North Carolina, which does 27, and Alabama, which is about as fast as North Carolina. And as with Tier 7s, the Gneisenau, does 32 knots, which is spectacular versus, the competition, because the Nagato, in its modernized form, does about 25 knots in a straight line, and when it turns, it could slow down to 15-ish. And the Colorado is absolutely miserable in that regard, by being capable of only 21 knots, if not, something in the high 20s. And obviously, if that thing turns, it slows down to a halt. It's kind of as slow as a tug. So essentially, a lot of people who like to argue in favor of, the slower, heavier dreadnought battleships versus, Gneisenau, which is, effectively the modern battlecruiser, is that, they give off speed, but they have better firepower and better armor. But that's only true to an extent. Because the Gneisenau, even though, it carries only 6 guns and they're smaller caliber guns, this ship also carries the same characteristics as, the Bismarck, with its quicker reload at 26 seconds. And essentially, in this very destroyer-rich environment, as you see on warships, the Gneisenau, as well as many of the battlecruisers that have fast battleships, essentially have the flexibility to relocate and to choose when to engage and when to disengage, and how to approach the enemy, and how to better present your armor profile against the enemy for survival's sake. And when you're in Colorado, sometimes simply in order for you to get into a position to engage, you have to present yourself in a vulnerable fashion. Sometimes in order for you to disengage, you also have to present yourself in a vulnerable fashion. And sometimes you're just too slow to disengage altogether. And obviously at other times, they could be so slow at getting into position, they can simply be left behind all game, and essentially losing or winning the game without getting involved to begin with. Ultimately, the slower American battleships design essentially follow the philosophy first spoke of by, I believe, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was, obviously a naval historian and theorist, who suggests that, the decisive battle is inevitable, and, firepower and protection will essentially win or lose your engagement. That mobility is futile. Obviously, I disagree, but that's roughly what it spoke of. Another trick the Gneisenau has up his sleeve is the fact that it's a battleship that carries torpedoes. They are the same torpedoes carried on essentially every single German cruiser.
Enemy cruiser sunk.
For example, the Königsberg at tier 5, all the way up to the Hindenburg at tier 10. So they do decent damage. I believe, their theoretical alpha roll is 104, actually 14k, should I say. Even though, when you hit torpedo belts and enemy armor, they don't roll as high. So in a sense, they are essentially like underwater high explosive shells. But the torpedo in many situations very much complements and compensates for the firepower situation of the Gneisenau. Even though you only have 6 guns, but you also get torpedoes, and you got the armor schemes that can brawl very well. So if you get close to the enemies, not only they will have trouble hurting you in many cases, but you can usually finish off the job by torpedoing them. And honestly, 3 torpedoes, if they all hit, you're easily doing 25 to 30k. And in many cases, when a brawl has gotten to that point, the enemy have less than that. So you can just blow them to pieces and send them to the bottom. Ultimately, the Nagato or the Colorado can say that. And if anything, when facing off against those ships, the Gneisenau can essentially run away when things are not favorable, and when it does engage, most likely it's got the armor to resist enemy fire, and when the torpedo hits, the enemy can't really do anything about it. Not to mention the Nagato and Colorado are seriously clumsy and lacking agility in comparison to the Gneisenau. But another way to look at the Gneisenau is almost as if this is a ship with almost a battleship's firepower and battleship's armor, but the mobility of a cruiser. Because ultimately at 32 knots, this thing's as fast as a Cleveland in a straight line. You might turn a little slower and you might lose more speed in the turn. And the rudder might be a little more sluggish, but ultimately, it has no problem dancing with cruisers. But unfortunately, for perhaps game balance sake, and you might as well ask, what the hell is wargaming thinking? Battleship caliber weapons are not always superior to cruiser caliber weapons, because cruiser have far higher theoretical DPM because they reload much quicker. So, in favorable situations, if the cruisers fire AP and penetrate or even do citadels, the cruiser can simply spit out way more damage than a battleship. Another thing about the cruiser is the fact that they can simply spam HE, especially if you're talking about a Russian cruiser or a Japanese cruiser. So even though the battleship fire much heavier shells with much greater penetration and much higher alpha, in the time being the cruiser can usually start multiple fires and damage multiple modules and whittle down a battleship. And especially if you consider fire come from many places, not only HE shells but also enemy airstrikes. And of course, you have only one mechanism to stop a fire, the repair consumable, but that thing is only in action for give or take a dozen seconds. Obviously, it's probably like 15. It also depends on the nationality of the ship, but starting a fire essentially, in many cases you bait a player into using their repair consumable early or at the wrong time, thus rendering their ship vulnerable to more fire and more flooding. So the fact that battleships are superior, especially battle cruiser fast battleships are superior to normal cruisers, especially these 8-inch or 6-inch treaty cruisers, it's really not a simple thing to consider and explain. I would say one bad thing about the Gneisenau's weapon is the fact that with only 6 barrels, sometimes you just simply do not have the number of projectiles needed to hurt a small and agile enemy target such as a destroyer, which is something that you absolutely need to do in many situations in which it comes down to you versus them. You can almost say that just simply because you only have 6 barrels, you have inferior RNG. But perhaps another good thing about the Gneisenau is the fact that it has very solid secondary armament, which is also typical of German battleships, especially from Tier 5 onward. Perhaps wargaming thought that the Germans historically had superior fire control, especially before the American radars hit. Also, their main caliber weapons are smaller and lighter. By beefing up their secondary armament, could render the ships more balanced and playable in game. And obviously, in real life, the German secondaries are also known to be rather decent. For example, during the engagement between Bismarck and Prince Eugen versus Prince of Wales and Hood, I believe the German secondaries also managed many hits as with their primary armament and caused multiple fires on the British ships. So here we are, the third replay for today's video. Essentially, this came from even late last year, as a matter of fact, when I was grinding, the British cruiser line. For better or for worse, I kind of stopped that grind after reaching tier 5, just simply because these ships are tricky to play. So perhaps, this is a good time and chance for you guys to see it for yourself, whether or not, this line is really worth the trouble. I would just say that, it might be, something that's kind of artificial and historically inaccurate, cooked up by wargaming, but the British cruisers ultimately are, really strange breed of animals, if you will. They're agile, they're fast in a straight line, and they turn very well. In terms of agility and mobility, you can almost see them as large destroyers. But unfortunately, in terms of protection and armor, they're extraordinarily fragile. Their citadel's huge and sits very high above the waterline. And the citadel usually only have sufficient armor to essentially activate the fuses of enemy armor-piercing shells to do devastating damage in your citadel. Their modules are fragile, as with the armor part of their ship. Enemy destroyers that spams HE, such as Russian/Soviet destroyers as well as American destroyers, can just absolutely devastate British cruisers. Simply because not only they start fire and damage modules, but their HE can usually do a lot of ridiculous damage to this ship. And in return, for better or for worse, the British cruisers' guns, for some reason, only fire AP shells in game. And that very much limits their usability and utility in game. Because, armor-piercing shells against, let's say, an angled enemy battleship, are you just gonna bounce off their bow, or bounce off their main belt, even when they're not angled, or bounce off their deck, And against enemy cruisers, sure, if they're sideways onward, or if they're not watching you, or they're not being careful, you can penetrate them or even citadel them and do a lot of damage. But if they do angle, most likely it's just gonna be a bounce fast. So essentially, you have to relocate or reposition yourself to get into a better position to do that. And a lot of times, that's more easily said than done. Against destroyers, I would say that the Danae, as well as any of the British cruisers, really struggle, at least in my eyes, because the destroyers in this game are essentially unarmored. So when you shoot a destroyer with armor-piercing shells, even the armor-piercing shells of a light cruiser, 152 millimeters, as in my ship, most likely your shells will penetrate and over-penetrate enemy destroyers without detonating. So they will essentially do minimum damage, which is 10% of the HP count for citadel penetration. And of course, being AP, their ability at causing module damage is minimal, and they won't start fires. So it's just really futile target practice that does minimum damage. Another thing about the name is the fact that even though it has 6 guns, they are all located on the center line rather than super firing turrets, except essentially the one in the front. So just simply because the fact that your own smokestacks, your own conning tower, your own upper works of the ship limits their firing arc, you essentially have to give or take present your sight profile to an enemy in order to train your weapons onto them. And that very much renders you in a largely vulnerable situation.
Torpedoes, dead ahead.
But perhaps to compensate for those traits, British cruisers have a few unusual, characteristics as well. For example, even though this is only a light cruiser and this is only a tier 4, it carries a repair consumable. So, like a battleship or a cruiser for tier 9 and tier 10, the Danae, as well as, any of the British cruisers, even at tier 3 with the Caledon, can repair, their lost health pool with the repair consumable. Even though, obviously the repair consumable has only marginal effect on, hit points lost to a Citadel. I believe, they can only recover at 10%. So, it helps, but, it's not really a lifesaver. Another thing to consider is the fact that, the Danae has hydro acoustic surge consumable on the ship, which is kind of unusual for, a cruiser, especially, for tier 4. But the hydroacoustic surge essentially allows you to, see things in the water that you cannot detect visually, such as, enemy torpedoes that are beyond your visual spotting range, as well as enemy destroyers hidden in smoke screens. So it comes in handy. But unfortunately, your ship lacks, HE shells, so that, when and if you do discover enemy destroyers in a smoke screen, chipping them away with AP shells is really a chore. And arguably a risky proposition. If anything, I would say that, a very good counter for the Danae will be American destroyers, because, they have no armor, so if you shoot them with AP, it's just gonna overpan and not do much. And
Enemy battleships sunk.
meanwhile, when they shoot back with HE, they'll definitely start fires, they'll definitely mess up your modules, and they'll definitely do ridiculous damage. And quite frankly, they can probably spam HE and start a couple fires and then switch to AP. 5-inch destroyer AP has no problem doing ridiculous things to this light cruiser at all. So definitely watch out on destroyers with good guns. Another interesting thing about the Danae, as well as British cruiser this tier, or quite frankly probably the entire line, is the fact that the torpedo armament on this ship is actually fairly decent. For example, the Danae has 4 launchers, 2 on each side, that are triple. The torpedoes does essentially 10k damage each, which is not a lot, but given the number of torpedoes, it's not useless at all. A weird thing about the British cruisers' torpedoes is the fact that you can launch them one at a time, or you can launch them all together in a tight spread. So the choice is different than your typical torpedo setup with a ship of another nationality. To essentially make you choose between a wide spread or a narrow spread. So this torpedo setup, in a sense, allows you to very much make better use of your limited resources. For example, you can micromanage the trajectory and timing of your torpedoes, every one of them. You can essentially, fire one torpedo, speculatively into the direction of the enemies and forces them to maneuver, and then fire the rest of your torpedoes at the position in which the enemies will be forced to maneuver to. Or, let's say if the enemy is sailing towards you at an angle or sailing away from you at an angle, and you realize there's multiple possibilities at which they can maneuver. For example, turn left or turn right, stop or not stop, slow down or not slow down. You can essentially preemptively fire torpedoes towards different positions at which the enemies would have been in those various scenarios. And more or less, some of them is bound to hit. You can't really do that with, a ship of another nation. In those cases, it's just a one-time thing. I mean, sure, if let's say if you're in my Miyoko, you have 2 spread of 3. So you might be able to waste a whole spread of 3 to bait the enemy and use a second spread to hit. But that's much more wasteful, and it doesn't offer you the same degree of micromanagement you can do in a British cruiser. But then and again, I must mention, sometimes, even though most ideally, you might, essentially put yourself in a more vulnerable position or get sidetracked or get distracted the more you try to micromanage your torpedo shots. Because, in those situations, if you do get to that point, there's a good chance you might be, neglecting your position, your speed, your armor profile, or, what your main armament, which are the guns, are doing at that point, for better or for worse. But anyways, going back to the game itself, essentially we are down to a 3 versus 3 situation. Unfortunately, the enemy has 2 destroyers and a cruiser versus our 2 battleships and a cruiser. A lot of people go as far as to say that, obviously, we got the battleship, we're gonna, have the upper hand. But sure, I mean, the battleship have a bigger health pool and more firepower. But they're kind of too clumsy to be effective in this situation, because enemies are really, small targets that have, excellent agility and excellent concealment, and that are capable of fighting back with their torpedoes. Also consider the fact that the map has so many small islands. You really renders the battleship as sitting docks versus the destroyers. Especially it's tier 3, so don't expect anybody on our team to be geniuses at all. It is what it is. So at this point, for a little bit, I didn't know where any of the enemies are. Sure, there's a smoke screen in front of me, and there's must be one of the enemy destroyers hiding in there. And then the enemy cruiser appeared. It's a tier 4 Japanese Kuma. And this is ultimately a good situation because he's trying to chase me down. Engaging me with his weapons. So, his trajectory is going to be predictable. And, also because he's closing in on me, that can, essentially help with, torpedo ranges. So, firing my torpedo back at the enemy, affords me relatively good hit probability, simply because the enemy is trying to get close. And the enemy took 2 torpedoes and 2 flaws and got blown to pieces. Now, to be honest, the Kuma feels very much like the Danae, except he carries HE shells, and the torpedoes does even more damage. It even has a catapult fighter for AA's sake, so it's a really good ship. And of course, durability-wise, the two is about similar. But thankfully, the enemy was kind of incompetent, so I got away with a Kraken and a win. But ultimately, I find the British cruiser to be a frustrating grind that doesn't really tolerate mistakes, and it's not exactly fun to play, unfortunately. It's a bit of a chore, like a hard math homework that you have to do to get your ass out of Dodge now that you really like the shit. So that's that. Anyway, last but not the least, we go back to the Gneisenau again. Obviously, I haven't had a chance to, explain more about the ship's characteristics. In terms of secondary armament, the Gneisenau essentially is fairly solid, as I said before, because in this fictional upgraded state, as you see in game right now, the Gneisenau carries, I believe, 128mm double dual-purpose anti-air and anti-surface secondary guns, versus the split 105mm anti-AA and light anti-surface and 150mm heavy anti-surface secondaries. So this means this ship essentially has more of a secondary armament capable of firing into the air, which is good for anti-air. But another thing to consider is the fact that by carrying 128mm rather than 150mm, the entirety of the secondary armament scheme, or should I say suite, essentially fires HE shells. Versus, let's say many of the Japanese mid-tier battleships with the 152s like the Congo or the Fuso, or the 140s like the Nagato, all they fire AP shells. Which consider the fact that your secondary armament has the accuracy of a catapult or slingshot, really renders the fact that they fire AP useless. It's kind of better to knock off a few modules and start a few fires than to hope that the unlikely event your secondary armament will actually do penetrating hits or essentially stid out enemies. Even though I have seen that before, I have seen a Miyoko essentially getting to a close range brawl with the enemy Nagato and end up taking multiple stid out hits from the 140mm AP firing secondary suites that Nagato has. But that's not really something you can really rely on, because that's RNG. There's just too much left to chance. In that case, you don't really play the game, but the game plays you. So it's life. One important thing about playing Battleship is you have to learn to micro-adjust and readjust and complement or react to what your team and what the enemy team, and much rather the entire flow of the gameplay. You can't just simply say that I'm gonna go to this key spot and I'm gonna try to hold it at all cost. I mean, it's not what it tanks, because to a large extent the mobility of ships in warships, even the mobility of a ship's core, counts for armor. It counts for carrying potential. It counts for firepower. Because the best armor you can have is not to get hit. The best firepower you can have is to be able to be in the right position at the right time to exert your influence on the enemy. Sure, you might have a fucking Armado, but you're gonna be 3 maps away and hiding. So you won't be doing anything. As you can see, my team has taken the A cap while the enemy has taken B, which is typical for ranked gameplay. Obviously, you want to try to go for 1 cap to begin with to achieve parity, so that the ticket counter with the points would not be rigged against your favor to begin with. As both teams start the game by starting to collect their own share of points. Of course, one sneaky tactic some of the teams have employed is to essentially send 1 destroyer to capture 1 cap, and to essentially dedicate your main force to the other cap, in hopes of the enemies going also for your main force, but losing a friend on all of the engagement, while your destroyer essentially takes the other cap and give your team a lead. And obviously, in this game mode, what you don't want to do is to split your forces evenly. 3 go on 1 cap, 4 go on the other cap, because in that case, the enemy can always, or much rather, almost certainly, have 1 cap, with a larger force, and thus can achieve a localized victory overwhelm your one half of your team. Meanwhile, worst come to worst, even if their destroyer capper on the other cap got annihilated, or if you just didn't bother going for the other cap, they're winning on in terms of damage and ship count, but they're not losing in terms of points neither. And once you're down 2 or 3 ships, having points being even due to the caps, obviously you're going to be behind because you lose ships. It's completely useless. See, this is the problem with warships, is because a lot of people came from tanks or other MMOs. They believe in the meta of a deathmatch, which, to be honest, is entertaining. It's a lot of fun, but it's not really helpful. When you disregard such important gameplay mechanic as the counter and the points. And so, one thing to know about the German battle cruisers, as with the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, and obviously, to a large extent with the British-style battle cruisers, which kind of get carried over to Japan with the Congo class, is the fact that, theoretically, their designers expect them to essentially be able to outmaneuver the enemies with their superior mobility, and thus allow them to carry less armor, or much rather be relatively safe and protected even with less armor. And if anything, the famous British Admiral Jackie Fisher was a major proponent of such a theory. Go read about him. He's kind of interesting, if you will. But I guess most video game nerds just don't give a damn about books at all. So that's that. So right now, I decided to essentially advance along one flank of the map because I know the enemy has taken other cap, and they have the secondary force of 2 battleships that's trying to flank the western flank of our cap. If they do take over this flank, they can essentially encircle and surround our capital A, and in that situation, my team will be in a relatively precarious situation, just simply because they will be fired at from multiple directions, and it's very hard to maneuver, it's very hard to return fire, it's very hard to better present your armor profile for the sake of protection that way. And so this situation is ultimately considered undesirable. I'm essentially in a 1 versus 2 situation, and the enemies I'm facing off against Colorado and Colorado, which are, obviously belongs to post-World War I generation of the 7 6-inch armed battleships. They display more weight. Their armor belt is as good as mine. The Colorado is probably even better at 350 give or take millimeters. They carry a total of 16-inch guns versus the 6 15-inch I have. So on theoretical terms, they would not have been able, or much better, I would not have been able to win this engagement, give or take. But here's what happened. Because I had superior mobility, I managed to dictate their terms of the engagement. I got closer on my own terms, while angling at my armor, so the enemies have trouble hurting me. Meanwhile, the enemies, because they're clumsier and they're slower to turn, they're slower in a straight line, render themselves vulnerable to my fire. Obviously, Nagato shot me his broadside, that ended up in a regrettable situation. And he took multiple penetrating hits as well as citadels and simply blown up and sunk. Meanwhile, the Colorado was forced to turn because I fired torpedo at him, just as I did on the Nagato, which was useless because he was already sunk by the time the torpedoes hit. But the torpedoes, along with my superior turning speed as well as straight line speed, essentially allow me to force the enemy Colorado into the position he's in right now. So the mobility does matter. And when he has nowhere to go, where he will go become very predictable. He's cornered, you know, as in a dead end street. He has to turn this way. And that's where, you know, my torpedoes managed to, you know, do the dirty work. So much for, you know, 2 more guns and bigger guns. You know, not only, you know, my secondary kind of, you know, started multiple fires on him and giving him a hard time, but my torpedoes was, you know, ultimately the decisive factor that kind of equalized the otherwise, you know, unbalanced matchup I faced. Keep calm, carry on. It is what it is. But unfortunately, the Colorado started a fire on my ship, and, you know, because I previously used my repair consumable on a previous fire, I could not, you know, extinguish this fire in time, so I had to burn a little bit, unfortunately. And this situation is, you know, is something that the Gneisenau really doesn't excel in, which is kind of historically inaccurate, because the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in the war were known to be very good snipers. I believe they engaged the British aircraft carrier Glorious at almost extreme range and managed to sink it along with its destroyer escort, even without radar fire control. Well, much rather they kind of have it, but it's not to the degree the Americans have in the war. But see, you know, because I only have 6 barrels and they have kind of questionable RNG, so, you know, when the enemies are at mid to long range, you know, it's really a fingers crossed, you know, hope RNG behave type of thing. But, you know, I think ultimately working with the RNG and the Gneisenau to balance things out. Because the Gneisenau had, let's say, the accuracy of Amagi or Iowa, and, you know, especially with his mobility, his armor, his torpedoes, his AA and secondary, it's just gonna rip a bunch, you know, mid-tier ship a new asshole. You know, something like the Congo, you know, something like New York, you know, even something like New Mexico. They're gonna run into this thing and they're probably gonna be fucked over. And in case you wonder why I'm, you know, kind of, you know, experiencing episode disorientation as well as enjoying my profanity, if you will, is because, you know, I'm kind of stuck in a very toasting environment and I'm just cooking off in sweat at this point. But, you know, perhaps, you know, that's not a bad thing because, you know, back in the day, most of these ships' working environments are not air conditioned. I mean, could you imagine how hot you will be in the boiler room and in the turrets and in the powder room, in the magazine? You know, I actually been in those spaces in some of the battleships, such as the USS New Jersey or the Alabama. I would just say that it's, you know, it's not a pleasant environment to be in without air conditioning. And of course, you know, War II was around the time when air conditioning are starting to be introduced on some of the ships, and especially with American ships serving the South Pacific. But, you know, it's very well known that, you know, the on-ship environment for many ships are kind of hellish. I recall, you know, them saying that the British battleships are kind of spewing steam on the inside, and obviously the Japanese battleships towards the end of the war become very cramped because they're essentially just stacking layers upon layers of 25mm AA guns on the deck, and they just need more crew to man them. So everybody have to sleep on hammocks and, you know, smell each other's armpit and sweat. Doesn't sound like fun, but, you know, it is what it is. So essentially in this game, we essentially have everything in the bag. I did at this point launch my catapult fighter just in case the enemy destroyer tried to sneak up on me, but that turned out not to be the case, as the enemy destroyers struggling to engage my allies to the south of the map. Meanwhile, once again, I'm getting into another brawl against the enemy's slow battleship, and ultimately my speed allowed me to once again be in a position at which, you know, the enemy have trouble responding. He's doomed at this point, because ultimately if you turn so slowly and if you're so slow in a straight line, what you do and where you go becomes so predictable.
Enemy battleship sunk.
You'll ultimately end up at exactly where the enemies want you to be, unfortunately. So the first game in the Bismarck, I essentially did 189k, 7 kills. Obviously, Dreadnought, Kraken, Confederate, secondary expert, or should I say close range expert. So I essentially got a half dozen medals. Obviously, top on the team. Engage multiple enemy heavy units such as the Baron, Gneisenau, Tirpitz, and there's some pretty solid work on them. Very good profit without premium account, 176k. I believe this was ran during a special event, so I had 8.6k worth of XP, which is nice because I was just starting the grind at that point. Second game, 113k damage, 4 sunk, almost a Kraken, 3 torpedo hits. Was one of the last 2 survivors on my team. Ranked gameplay definitely carried the team. I essentially one salvoed, 2 of their main tier 7 cruisers, and did pretty solid work on the Colorado. Very good profit also, 172k without a premium. As with the Danae, I got a Kraken and Devastating Strike once again. A total of 5 torpedo hits. I blew 2 on the Kuma, 3 on the Kawachi, 5 kills, including a bunch of destroyers that, you know, the ship had really a lot of problem killing. Essentially took down the Kawachi, and, you know, other victims throughout the course of that skirmish, which is, you know, ultimately the purpose of the cruiser. As with the last game in the Gneisenau, I ended up doing 180k, pretty good profit. A lot of torpedo hits. Only 3 kills, 2 fires, 3 flooding, 4 citadel. Pretty solid secondary hits count, which probably in turn did pretty solid fire damage and causes the enemy to visit repairs. Top on the team. And I did 72k, 65k, and 30k on the enemy Nagato, Colorado, and Colorado. So it goes to show that even though you are playing a more lightly armed battleship, your speed and your flexibility, along with your solid secondary and torpedo armament, really works very well against, you know, those who only have big guns and nothing else, especially speed. So, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.